other side.
The rain battered the attic window, a relentless rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart as I knelt on the creaky floorboards. My fingers trembling around a wooden box I wasn't supposed to find. My name is Mar, and at 25, I thought I knew who I was, the adopted daughter of Dr. Richard and Professor Evelyn Harper, Seattle's golden couple, their lives a carefully curated display of charity and success. But that night, as the storm raged outside, the contents of that box would unravel everything: my family, my past, and the fragile identity I'd clung to for so long. The attic smelled of dust and forgotten things, the air heavy with secrets that had been waiting for me to uncover them. I'd grown up in a house that gleamed with perfection. Polished hardwood floors stretched from the foyer to the dining room, where crystal chandeliers caught the light just so. Bookshelves lined with academic journals and leather-bound classics stood as testaments to my parents' brilliance. Framed photos adorned the walls, me smiling at charity galas, Richard shaking hands with hospital donors, Evelyn mid-lecture at the university, her eyes alight with passion. Richard was a pediatric surgeon, his name synonymous with compassion in Seattle's medical circles. Evelyn taught literature, her classes so mesmerizing they drew students from beyond the campus. They were the kind of people who made you feel small but safe, their presence a shield against the world's chaos. And I, Mara Harper, was their miracle child, adopted at 3 from a remote corner of Oregon, saved from a life of uncertainty, or so they'd always told me. But the cracks had started to show long before I found the box. It began with Evelyn, my mother, whose warmth had once filled our home like sunlight. Over the past year, she'd changed. The woman who used to recite poetry at the dinner table, her voice weaving stories of love and loss, had become a shadow. She barely slept, her eyes red-rimmed and distant, darting to corners of the room as if expecting someone to step out of the darkness. She'd snap at me for the smallest things, leaving a dish in the sink, forgetting to lock the back door, then apologize with hugs that felt too tight, too desperate. At night, I'd hear her pacing the hallway, her footsteps a restless rhythm, and sometimes a whisper. Elise. The name meant nothing to me, but it hung in the air like a ghost, heavy with a grief I couldn't name. I tried to ask her about it once, over breakfast. When Richard was at the hospital. Who's Elise? I said, my voice casual, hoping to catch her off guard. Her coffee cup rose halfway to her lips, her face paling as if I'd struck her. No one, she said, too quickly, her eyes avoiding mine. Just a character from a book I'm teaching. But I knew she was lying. Evelyn was a terrible liar, her hands fidgeting, her smile too tight. I let it go. But the name burrowed into me, a seed of doubt that refused to stay buried. Then she disappeared. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day where the sky seemed to press down on the city. Gray and unforgiving, Evelyn's car was found abandoned by the shores of Lake Moonridge, an hour outside Seattle. The driver's door was open, her purse still on the passenger seat, her phone tucked inside. With a dead battery, the police searched for days, divers scouring the lake's murky depths, volunteers combing the surrounding woods, but they found nothing. No body, no footprints, no sign of a struggle. The headlines called it a tragic suicide, a beloved professor, lost to her own despair. Richard was inconsolable, his usually composed demeanor crumbling as he spoke to reporters, his voice raw with grief. She was everything to us, he said, his eyes glistening for the cameras. If anyone knows anything, please help us find her. The city mourned with him, flowers piling up at the lake's edge, a makeshift memorial for a woman everyone loved. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that Evelyn would turn up with some explanation, a breakdown, a momentary lapse. But deep down, I knew better. Evelyn wasn't the type to vanish without a word. She was deliberate, precise, her life as carefully structured as the poetry she taught. The police called it an open and shut case, but I couldn't let it go. I started searching the house, driven by a need I couldn't explain. I went through her study, her desk drawers, her laptop, looking for anything that could tell me why she'd left or what had taken her. That's when I found the box in the attic. Richard had always told me to stay out of the storage room, claiming it was full of old medical equipment and papers too boring for me to bother with. But grief makes you reckless. And I'd climbed the narrow stairs one night when he was at a late surgery. The box was tucked behind a stack of journals. It's wood-worn but sturdy. The lock rusted, but intact. I pried it open with a screwdriver, my hands shaking as I lifted the lid. Inside was a photograph that stopped my heart. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, with blonde hair and wide blue eyes, clutching a stuffed rabbit. On the back, in Evelyn's elegant script, was a single line, Elise, 1996. My breath caught in my throat. I'd never heard of an Elise. I was the only child my parents had ever mentioned, the only one they'd raised, but the photo felt heavy with secrets, its edges worn as if someone had held it too often, tracing the face of a child who no longer existed. The box held more than just the photo. There were letters, yellowed and brittle, addressed to no one, a locket with a broken clasp, engraved with the initial CJ drawing, childish, but careful, of a house by a lake, signed Jamal. Age 6, my mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who were these children? Why were their things hidden away like relics of a life my parents wanted to forget? I took the box to my room, locking the door behind me, and spent hours sifting through its contents. Each item was a piece of a puzzle I didn't understand, but the weight of it pressed against me, a truth I wasn't ready to face. I started digging deeper, quietly at first, afraid of what I'd find. The house felt different now, its silence oppressive, every creak a warning that I was crossing a line. I searched Evelyn's study, her file cabinets, her laptop, looking for anything that could explain the photo or her disappearance. That's when I found the adoption records, buried in a locked drawer I pried open with the same screwdriver I'd used on the box. They weren't just my records, though mine were their sparse, clinical, detailing my adoption from an orphanage in Oregon. In 2001, there were 3 others. Elise, adopted in 1996, Cody in 1998, and Jamal in 2000. Their names were unfamiliar, their faces absent from the family albums that line our shelves. But the records told a chilling story. Each child had lived in this house, raised by Richard and Evelyn, and each had vanished without a trace. The police reports I found online were sparse. The cases closed quickly. Elise, age 6, missing since 1997, presumed to have run away. Cody, age 7, missing since 1999, assumed drowned in a nearby river. Jamal, age 5, missing since 2000, believed to have been abducted. No bodies, no suspects, no real investigation. The reports noted Richard and Evelyn's cooperation, their grief, their spotless reputations. No one had suspected them, not the celebrated doctor who saved children's lives, not the professor who inspired generations. They were untouchable, their charity work a shield, their donations to children's causes a testament to their goodness. But I couldn't ignore the questions clawing at me. Who were these children? Why had they disappeared? And what did any of this have to do with Evelyn's absence? I needed help, someone who could see past my parents' polished exterior. That's when I found Ben Carter, a freelance journalist with a reputation for chasing stories others wouldn't touch. He was in his late 30s, with a scruffy beard and a skepticism that matched my own. We met at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the coffee was bitter and the booths were sticky. I showed him the photo of Elise, the adoption records, the locket, the drawing. His eyes narrowed as he read, his fingers tapping the table in a restless rhythm. "This isn't just a family secret," he said, his voice low. "This is a pattern. And patterns like this don't happen by accident." We started with the orphanage in Oregon, a 6-hour drive through forests that seemed to hold their own secrets. The facility was abandoned now, its windows boarded up, the sign up front faded to illegibility. But Ben had contacts people who could pull strings, access records that were supposed to be sealed. What we found was chilling. My adoption file was nearly empty, a single scan page so blurry it was barely legible. But one detail stood out. My name wasn't Maura Harper, it was Lena Dawson. The name felt foreign, like a stranger's, but it stirred something deep inside me, a memory I couldn't grasp, like a dream slipping away in the morning light. Ben dug deeper, cross-referencing my file with missing persons reports from 2001. That's when we found it, a report filed by a woman named Margaret Dawson, claiming her 3-year-old daughter, Lena, had vanished during a wildfire in rural Oregon. The case was closed when no body was found, the assumption being that I'd perished in the flames. But I hadn't. I'd ended up here, in Seattle, raised by Richard and Evelyn as their own. The question was why and how. Ben tracked down a retired psychologist who treated Evelyn in the late 1990s, a woman named Dr. Helen Voss. She was reluctant to talk, citing confidentiality. But Ben's persistence wore her down. Over a crackling phone line, she revealed that Evelyn had suffered a miscarriage in 1996, a loss that shattered her. She became obsessed with replacing the child she'd lost. Dr. Voss said she spoke of finding the perfect child, someone to fill the void. It wasn't healthy, but I never thought it would lead to anything sinister. Sinister? The word lodged itself in my mind. A splinter I couldn't dislodge. I started having nightmares again, ones I'd had as a child, but dismissed as figments of my imagination. In them, I was small, curled up in a dark, cold space, my breath fogging the air, hands pressed against my throat. Not hard enough to kill, but enough to terrify. I'd wake up gasping, my heart pounding, the room spinning. I'd always thought they were just dreams, the product of an overactive mind. But now they felt like memories, fragments of a past I'd been too young to understand. One night, while searching my bedroom for more clues, I found something that turned my blood to ice. A child's necklace, its silver chain caught in a crack in the floorboards under my bed. Etched into the pendant was a single word, Elise. I confronted Richard the next day, my voice shaking as I held up the necklace. His face, usually so composed, flickered with something I couldn't name, fear, maybe, or anger. "You're digging into things you don't understand," he said, his tone sharp, his eyes cold. "Let it go, Mar, for your own good." But I couldn't. The next week, he suggested I see a therapist, claiming I was unstable, that grief over Evelyn was clouding my judgment. He started watching me, his presence suffocating, his footsteps lingering outside my door at night. One evening, I caught him standing in the hallway, just staring, his silhouette framed by the dim light. That's when I knew I had to leave. I packed a bag and fled to Oregon, to the address listed in my adoption file. It led me to a small, weathered house in a town called Willow Creek, where an elderly woman named Ruth Dawson lived. She was my grandmother, Margaret's mother, and when she opened the door, her eyes filled with tears. "Lena," she whispered, pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. She showed me a photo of myself at 3, my dark curls unmistakable, and a letter from my mother, Margaret, dated just before my disappearance. "They took you," Ruth said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and grief. "Your mother swore she didn't abandon you. She said someone set that fire, someone who wanted you gone." The truth came in fragments, each one sharper than the last. Margaret, my birth mother, wasn't dead. She was in a low-security prison, serving time for child abandonment, or charge she'd always denied. Ben and I visited her, driving through a landscape that felt both familiar and alien. The woman who sat across from me in the visitation room was a shadow of the vibrant mother Ruth had described. Her hair was gray, her eyes hollow. But when she saw me, she reached across the table, her hands trembling. "Lena," she said, her voice breaking, "I knew you were alive." She told us everything, how Richard and Evelyn had approached her after the fire, offering to help by taking me in. How they manipulated her, threatened her with legal action, ensured she'd never see me again. They wanted a child, she said, her voice hollow. But they didn't want me to be part of your life. The final piece fell into place when I returned to Seattle, determined to confront the truth. I broke into Richard's office at the hospital, my heart pounding, as I rifled through his desk. Hidden in a locked drawer was a journal, its pages filled with Evelyn's handwriting. She hadn't killed Elise, Cody, or Jamal. She loved them in her own broken way, seeing them as replacements for the child she'd lost in 1996. But when they grew older, when they asked questions or wanted to leave, Richard stepped in. The journal didn't spell it out, but the implications were clear. He'd silence them permanently to protect the perfect life he'd built. Entries described his discipline, his need to maintain order, his fear that the children would expose their secrets. I found Evelyn in a motel on the outskirts of town, tracked down through a tip from one of Ben's contacts. She was a wreck, her hair disheveled, her eyes wild with guilt. I didn't know, she sobbed, clutching my hands. I thought I could save them, keep them safe. But Richard, he said they'd ruin us. I convinced her to come forward, to tell the police everything. Her testimony led to a search of the property, and in the wooded area behind our house, they found what I dreaded, the remains of Elise, Cody, and Jamal. Buried shallowly, their lives erased to preserve a lie. Richard was arrested, his reputation crumbling as the city recoiled from the monster he'd been. I stood by Lake Moonridge one last time, the necklace with Elise's name heavy in my hand. The water was still, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. I thought of the children who'd come before me, their voices silenced, their stories buried. I thought of my mother, Margaret, who'd lost everything, and Evelyn, who'd loved to desperately, to dangerously. I threw the necklace into the lake, watching it sink beneath the surface. We're free now, I whispered, to Elise, to Cody, to Jamal, to myself. The lake didn't answer, but in its silence, I found peace.